It was incredible the way that the team banded together and all those people came to assist us. We managed to save the boat through, I'm trying to think, it was probably 5 or 6 hours, something like that, just trying to stabilize the boat so it wouldn't sink. Wrapping a sail around it, all kinds of floats tied to it, just anything to not let it go under the water. And then, so we towed it back in reverse at like 3 knots. So I think it got back to the base at midnight. I don't know. That whole kind of that day and the whole next 10 were a bit of a blur. Everybody got together and we said, look, this is obviously not the outcome anybody wanted, but we're here now. And what do we need to be racing again in 10 days. Like the timetable is set. The matches aren't going to move. Either we show up to the start line or we've lost, like we're out. Victories happen all the time in business and in sport. And until the last chip is played and you're out, like there's always something more you can do, to the point where we had all these little bits and bobs that we were working on right up till the very last day. Until we knew that there wasn't going to be another race, we were looking for that 0.001% incremental gain, because you just never know if that's going to be the difference maker. And I think if you have that mindset where you're just constantly trying to eke out those small gains and grind in that way, that's always going to serve you well, no matter like what you're looking at. Is the marginal gain that this thing might deliver worth that potential trade-off? That's a very hard thing to know. And that's true. That's not just in the America's Cup. That's true everywhere. You know, we have these chats every day of like, well, is refactoring this really worth it? And quantifying that stuff can be really hard, but it really puts a fine point on it, because you can't get that time back and you have to be on the start line on X date. There's no moving of deadlines. Like you have, in a way, the product has to ship. Like you don't have an option, and you've sunk $100 million plus into getting on that start line. So there's just no excuses.
Welcome to the Tech Waka podcast, where we dive into the journeys of New Zealand's top tech leaders. Your host for today is Jakub, bringing you conversations with tech leaders and innovators from across Aotearoa. Join us as we uncover the experiences, challenges, and successes that shape our tech community.
Welcome back to Tech Waka. Today we are diving into a fascinating journey with Brett Terpstra, once the IT mastermind behind American Magic's America's Cup campaign, and now driving innovation at Halter. Brad shares his unique stories and insights about teamwork, decision-making, and what it means to be watched by millions of sailing fans. Let's get into it. Hi everyone. Hi Brad. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. Thanks.
Can you tell our audience a bit about yourself?
My name's Brad. I hail from the United States, as you might have picked up on already from my accent, originally from Michigan. Found my way in New Zealand by way of the America's Cup. So I worked for American Magic in the 36th America's Cup when we contended for it here in Auckland. Previous to that, had some roles in the automotive manufacturing space, working for GM, and then running a sailboat composites carbon fiber shop back in Michigan. Now at Halter, which is an ag tech company that makes a smart collar for cattle that allows us to virtually fence and monitor the behavior of the cattle on farm.
Let's focus on the America's Cup experience, because it seemed quite unique and not many people have that kind of experience. And when I think about America's Cup, and I did manage to watch the sailing when it was here in Auckland, and it was either at the waterfront or on TV. So that's kind of my experience with it. What was your experience? What was your role? How did it look like from the inside?
Yeah. So I was a IT manager for the team, which was quite an exciting role, because it meant that I touched essentially every facet of the team. Specifically, it was very involved in the boat computer network systems, but also the high performance cluster that we use for design simulations, all the way down to, the printer doesn't work and setting up networking and a little bit of everything. But what that also meant is that I did get out on the water a decent amount to monitor the health of the systems on the yacht while we were practicing and racing, which was an incredible experience. Auckland is an amazing stadium for sailing. I was very sad when the cup didn't come back here, and the people really turned out. It was COVID, and I think New Zealand really showed up in force, and it was just an incredible thing to be a part of. And really grateful for the experience.
How large was your team? Was it just you, or did you have a bunch of people working with you or alongside you? How did it look like?
Yeah, so I was a one-man team for
Wow.
some of the functions. So on the specific like boat design aspect, there was what we referred to as the mechatronics team, which handled basically all the electronics in the boat. So I worked closely with them for the boat aspects. But then when it came to things like managing all the endpoints and the network inside the base and a variety of other functions, and then I was kind of on my own. So there was, and then we had the design team had a little bit of built-in. So we employed a bunch of people from a naval architecture firm that was already pre-existing. They had a little bit of contract help that jumped in from time to time to do some odds and ends, but it was primarily, I guess, me and like a couple other people within the mechatronics team that were sort of the main, I guess, IT people that if there was an issue, depending on where it was, like those would be the people you'd ask. But for the most part, the team members were pretty switched on. So, you didn't get a lot of password reset requests and things like that we managed to make that all fairly self-serve and try to keep it relatively high level.
And how many users did you have to serve?
Yeah, so we had, I think at the peak we had 120 people.
Okay.
Now a decent chunk of that was production crew that still needed email access, and they'd have to look at drawings, and we used the Google Suite for all that stuff. But so they were relatively low impact. It was the designers, administration, sailors, shore team and then just the boat itself that obviously like took the brunt of the effort to manage.
When I think about America's Cup, I think about cutting edge technology. Was that the case? Like, what was some of the tech stack, or maybe some mind blowing things that people may not think about, or maybe some of the boring stuff that everyone uses anyway? Like, tell us more about the tech stack.
Yeah, it was quite an interesting thing because it has a fundamental problem of you can't buy more time, and no matter how much money you have. And so you're always constantly trying to decide, well, is the thing that we need, can we get something off the shelf? Because that's always kind of the quickest solution. So you're always largely optimizing for that, and then trying to figure out almost nothing fits your needs exactly as it comes off the shelf. So it's like, well, does a 10% reduction still allow me to do what I need to do? And is that kind of acceptable? Or do we need to start thinking about building something on our own? So there was a lot of a fair amount of off the shelf stuff like Ubiquiti gear. And, we're just buying laptops from Dell and buying servers from Dell, and all that stuff looks pretty, I guess, standard. It's kind of how we deploy those things. But then some of the more interesting bits were, because the yacht gets so hot, by and large, all the computers were fanless embedded kind of systems. So that starts to limit your ability to pick maybe what you want, and you're stuck with things that have good thermal management or large temperature operating ranges. They also need to be light, and so you can't necessarily just slap in a fan or to the point where when we're fitting out the boat, you go on with a bag full of zip ties, and that all gets weighed. And then when you come off, all this trash that you take with you also gets weighed, because the boat has a very strict weight limit that you need to meet. And so even the ends of zip ties are things that you're essentially cataloging the weight of, and it all does eventually add up. We had a hybrid cloud setup. I would say the tech stack was certain aspects of it were reasonably cutting edge, but then, databases, your classic like Postgres, MySQL, a fair bit of Java, a fair bit of C++. And then the design tools that were, I guess, a lot of the magic happened. A lot of that was bespoke tooling, fair few Python scripts, some other stuff that's just managed by the very like esoteric simulation companies. You buy your Siemens piece of kit, and then you're designing scripts to run kind of within those frameworks. We use the Unity engine to run the simulator, and so then we're coding digital twin, so to speak, that we could make changes to on the design front, and the sailors could sail. Not that dissimilar from like an F1 simulator that you might see. Theirs is probably more advanced, but the same principles apply. And And there was a lot of very advanced math that would go into the background of the simulator, but it looked, like a computer game.
When I think about America's Cup again, I think about the sailors, on the water, and I wonder how much of your work and the simulation and the IT work, how much could that influence the result of a race? Like, could you quantify it in some way, or give us some examples when maybe there were some situations when that maybe you made the right decision, or your team made the right decision and it helped you win, or maybe the decision was the other way around, that you made the decision and that we should have done something else because that's why we were losing. Was there anything like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in general, it's kind of the sum of your decision making. So by and large, there's unlikely to be one single decision that it makes or breaks it for you, at least in the space that I'm operating in. For the actual sailors, like a tactical decision definitely could win or lose them the race. But I think a lot of it does come back to the time comment that I made earlier, where your days on water are so limited. Even on the days that you're able to go sailing, sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate. So when you look, and then you have breakages and things on top of that, and the sailing the boat is there's no substitute. So the teams try to use a simulator as much as they can to create meaningful data not requiring on-water time. But there's also no substitute for on-water time. But the amount of effort that has to go in to get the boat sailing on any given day is significant. And so that time is so precious. And so to give you one scenario for your question, so I set up the network on the boats where the chase boats would talk to the sailboat, and we'd get all the data off the boat and live video feeds. There was a computer on one of the chase boats that housed a database that we were streaming into. And so the network just was not cooperating for that day. We had kind of been sailing around for about an hour, let's say, and everyone was very much not happy with how it was currently going. And I had checked a number of things and was really struggling to kind of get to the bottom of it. And then it was back to basics, what do I do? And so I just started going through the connections. So I traced the path all the way from the computer out to the antenna. And there was an amplifier that I had installed kind of in the back of the boat, kind of tucked away. And the coax connector for it had unscrewed itself. And so basically the antenna wasn't connected. And so 10 seconds, I screwed that back on and everything was happy again. Mm-hmm. But, we lost probably 1 to 2 hours. I mean, we were getting by, but it wasn't a great experience. And your total sailing hours for the campaign we had somewhere maybe 130 sailing days. I'm just trying to do some quick math here. So you probably, around 600 to 800 hours. So let's call it 700, so I lost us, a half a percent of our sailing time over the course of the campaign in a way, which may seem like a small number, but when those losses stack up, and invariably there will be losses, things break, you're on the very bleeding edge, nothing's going to work straight out of the box. So the amount that you can minimize downtime is just absolutely paramount.
Oh yeah. And then all of the elements you cannot control, like weather, people making mistakes, all of this stuff is just elevated.
Yeah. And so going back to your tech stack question a little bit, I think that is also an influence on the decision making, because you have to be careful you don't get out too far over your skis with untested frameworks, untested hardware, things like that, because you can spend a lot of time troubleshooting and debugging. And so, is the marginal gain that this thing might deliver worth that potential trade-off? That's a very hard thing to know. And that's true. That's not just in the America's Cup. That's true everywhere. We have these chats every day of well, is refactoring this really worth it? And quantifying that stuff can be really hard, but it really puts a fine point on it, because you can't get that time back, and you have to be on the start line on X date. There's no moving of deadlines. You have, in a way, the product has to ship. You don't have an option, and you've sunk $100 million plus into getting on that start line. So there's just no excuses.
Yeah, and the opportunity cost, right? And I wonder, how do you deal with your own interests and your own ego? Because sometimes we have these pet projects, things that we want to try, things that we know is going to make it better, or, we are just curious about something, and when you work, we just try to squeeze this in, try something here, try something on the side. But in your context, it was much different because you had this very constrained time and budget. So you couldn't probably allow this level of flexibility, or maybe you did.
The cup is inherently a design competition. And so if you just stay in the lane of what's known, you're pretty unlikely to win. So I think everybody accepts some level of uncertainty and and willingness to experiment in that space. I think I would take that back to the most important thing there is applying a first principles approach. So for one person to try something kind of by itself probably is not necessarily that meaningful from a resources perspective. Oftentimes they can probably execute it on their own and it might be okay. When everybody has something they want to try, now you get to the scale problem where it's like, all right, well, what do we try first? What's the most important? And I think that's where it's really important that the various teams are really, really, really differentiating between what are all the things that we're looking at and what are the most important things to be applying resource to. Because otherwise you can spend so much time chasing your tail on things that are unlikely to pay off. And I think in my observation that there was probably more we could have done to interrogate stuff earlier on in the process in terms of how valuable it would be. But it is, I mean, hindsight's also 2020. So I haven't been on another team, and so it's hard to compare. It's a very hard balance to strike because also the thing could be kind of the winner, right? Like there are many examples of singular ideas winning the cup. And so you definitely need to allow for that room to experiment. But I think something up from the outside, observing and kind of talking to some people, something that Team New Zealand does incredibly well is their resource management and really evaluating heavily how much time and effort, both from a money and people perspective, is any kind of initiative going to take. And I think that's kind of their superpower, and why they've been so successful is they don't have as many resources as some of the other teams do. And so they by nature have to be very, very vigilant with how they spend every dollar and every minute. And I think they've ingrained that into their culture to account for that stuff very well, which really primes you to then be asking really good questions and evaluating, well, is this worth doing? Like, okay, maybe we gave it a crack. We spent a couple days on it. It hasn't paid off. Like it's now diminishing returns and we can't afford to spend more time on it. We have more important stuff to do.
You touched a bit about different teams working together, and it's triggered a question. What about structure and how teams work together? In software, we often talk about Scrum and extreme programming and Kanban. Did you have any elements of that in your teams?
This might be a controversial take, but I think that I've always been of the idea that they're all frameworks, right? And they present you with a kind of predefined way of thinking about things. And that's really useful because you don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. But I think the fundamental principles that underpin all those frameworks aren't like that widely different. So I think at the highest level, it just comes back to communicating really effectively what you're trying to do, communicating really effectively why it's important. And there's always trade-offs to be made, right? And so in those discussions, making sure that everybody has a really good understanding of why the stuff is most important, and then making the effective trade-offs and deciding like, well, what aren't we working on? I think that's the most powerful question you can often ask is why aren't we doing something? We just had a conversation today at Halter that strongly aligns with that sentiment, where we have a few different things going on at the moment, and we're trying to figure out what's the most important, and getting to that like simple answer can be quite hard sometimes because you're like, well, they're all important. And it's like, well, yeah, but also you can't work on everything, or, you wind up doing nothing, like prioritizing everything and you wind up prioritizing nothing. So.
Yeah. It's almost going back to one of the principles from Agile Manifesto, which is the art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. Yeah, as you said, we have limited resources, limited time. How do we make sure we work on the right thing at the right time? Yeah.
To specifically answer your question, though, I think it would probably mostly emulate a Kanban system.
Mm.
And then at Halter, that's, at least for my team, I would say it's a little bit of a hybrid of kind of Agile Kanban, but I'd say it most emulates that. But it's often just like, what's the most important thing? When you've answered that question, the rest of it is kind of detail. So that's what we spend the most time on, trying to figure out what's the most important thing to be doing. And then the ordering and, can we put 3 people on it, or is it 1 person in series, or determining, some of these kind of questions, like that's all detail you can work out. But if you haven't landed why it's most important and what the outcome's going to be, you're going to like you can do all the Agile planning you want. It's not going to get you a good outcome.
Let's talk about a specific scenario from that, one America's Cup, when thousands, if not millions of people are watching it on TV and American Magic just collapsed, or, just start sinking. What happened there? Like, how did you guys react to that? What was happening?
Yeah.
Take us there.
Yeah. That was a big moment for the team. So for those that didn't see it, we were in the Challenger Selection Series match against Luna Rosa, and we were winning the race, rounded the top mark. The boat came basically flying out of the air and did a big nose up and then came crashing down. What ultimately happened was the boat landed pretty hard on its side. It didn't kind of land square down, and that's not really an orientation the boat is intended to sit in, and also, or like crash in. And also we were moving at a rather large rate of knots, and it did go full kind of nose up. So the nose at its peak was probably 50 feet, or what would that be? Call it 20 meters in the air or something like that.
Yeah. Wow.
So it had a fair distance to fall at the front of the boat, and that's where a hole got punched in. So when the boat kind of landed on the side, the force of the water impacting the flat hull just punched a big hole in a panel. And if you look really, really close at the video, you can actually see the piece of panel like floating away from the boat just after it had crashed. So yeah, I was at the base that day, watching from our like hospitality area where we had a bunch of TVs and stuff, and the team that wasn't on the water would gather and watch the racing. So I saw that happen, was obviously very disappointed. That I knew immediately. I was like, well, race over, obviously. Even if we hadn't put a hole in the boat, the boat wasn't going to be able, once it falls over on its side, there's no way for it to right itself. And so you need the chase boat to pull it back up, which means you're disqualified. So just immediately knew that we had lost that race. What I didn't know at the time was that we had actually punched a hole in the boat. So I went back to my desk and was prepping for, okay, the boat's going to come in. We're going to have to debrief and figure out what we need to do. And I was kind of like running through my after racing like checklist already. And then I kind of noticed there was like a fair bit of activity like out in the base. And so I was like, I kind of wonder what's going on, and like tuned back into the video feed and was like, oh, okay, this is a bit more significant than I had expected, which accounted for all the additional activity. So, incredible amount of gratitude to all the other teams involved in the event. The boat would be at the bottom of the Rocky Gulf if not for all the other teams, Auckland Fire and Rescue, anyone that came to lend a hand. It was incredible the way that the team banded together and all those people came to assist us. We managed to save the boat through, I'm trying to think, it was probably 5 or 6 hours, something like that, just trying to stabilize the boat so it wouldn't sink, wrapping a sail around it, all kinds of floats tied to it, just anything to not let it go under the water. And then, so we towed it back in reverse at like 3 knots. So I think it got back to the base at midnight. I don't know. That whole kind of that day and the whole next 10 were a bit of a blur. But so we were organizing some stuff from shore. There was a few trips that got made out to the boat to bring things, additional pumps and floats and just whatever we knew that we had in the base that might be useful. our shore team manager, Tim Hackett, did an incredible job of organizing people. And so then boat got back, it got lifted out of the water. We saw sort of the extent of the damage, especially for those who were seeing it for the first time. The very short answer is like we got to work. I think it was an incredible moment to see how much the team gelled around that experience. We pulled the boat into the shed, closed up the doors. Everybody got together and we said, look, this is obviously not the outcome anybody wanted, but we're here now. And what do we need to be racing again in 10 days. Like the timetable is set. The matches aren't going to move. Either we show up to the start line or we've lost. Like we're out. We were very much on the back foot at that point. And so from that point, it was like, anybody who needs anything, tell us what you need. Otherwise, everybody just broke apart into kind of their various groups and was like, what do we need to do to get this boat sailing again? The interesting thing was that the mechanical side of it was kind of the easiest problem to fix, and that undersells it a bit. It was still a very hard thing to do, but I think we had the hull repaired in 5 days, I want to say. It was the electronics were honestly the scariest part because everything got soaked.
All right.
And we did have most spares, so we were reasonably well prepared for this scenario. However, we couldn't replace a bunch of stuff. A lot of the wiring we didn't have spares of. I don't know exactly how many, it's probably a mile or two of wiring to all up inside of that boat. Some of it we had spare for, some of it we didn't. And so, basically it was like replace everything we could, get everything all reconfigured. The stuff that we can't replace, we tested as thoroughly as we could to try to ensure that we weren't going to have any bugs. And each team just executed. I mean, incredibly long days. It's very interesting, and especially looking back, like when you have that level of purpose and you're so singularly focused on an outcome, it's incredible what you can achieve. And so, I look back very fondly on that because even though it was one of the most trying times I've ever been through, it was also one of the coolest just to see the team respond and to get back out there. I would have loved for it to been the kind of Cinderella story where I could tell you we got back out there and we won and ticker tape parade in New York City and everything came out, the fairy tale ending. Unfortunately, that's not how it went. We got back out there and still struggled a bit and ultimately didn't live up to the expectations that we had set up for ourselves when we started. But I wouldn't trade that experience for anything.
That's just amazing to live through that. And I had a couple of examples when I had production incidents and we had to, work for a couple of days and kind of the data and make sure the systems are up, but never to that extent, I think. So thank you for sharing because it's a very unique and special experience that you just shared. And it also reminded me of when I talk to teams and when I try to kind of, especially when there's a new team or maybe the team goes through some troubles, I try to use the metaphor of a small sports team. And how I often do it is I ask the team what is their favorite sports team. And I was going to talk about, Lakers or All Blacks or some, Argentina soccer team or, whatever it is. And then we start going, okay, so what makes these teams special? Even though they are maybe from different sports, they have the core of similarities that make them so successful and so lovable. And it's kind of what you talked about reminded me of that a bit, And I wonder, what did you learn about working as a team, maybe that you bring to Halter and other teams, and what we can learn from sports, do you think that we can bring to our teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of parallels with sport that can be drawn across to professional like business endeavors. One for sure is just going to be how important it is to be clear about what's most important and why you're working on that thing. And I think that has to happen at every level of the organization. So if at a exec kind of CEO level, you're not clear, whether that's a sports team, whether that's Halter, whether that's AWS, if they're not clear about what the real high level goal is, and whether that's a mission statement or whatever form that comes in, a clear articulation of like why everyone's there, it's going to be tough to find traction any further down. And then each kind of layer you step down, I think the same is true. It's just like the scope gets smaller and smaller, ultimately resulting in you having a very clear articulation of why that project for that sprint is important to the engineer or engineers that are working on it. Like how does, and that's something we work really hard at Halter, is trying to always tie back those like small kind of atomic units at work to the mission and like, why are we here? Why are we doing this? And same with American Magic, where sometimes you have to reality check yourself and be like, what am I trying to solve here? How does this thing I'm doing help us win the cup? And oftentimes you'll find like this isn't moving us forward at all. And so then you can have a conversation about, well, is this something I can just outsource? Like, can I make this somebody else's problem? Is it a buy versus build question? Is it something I need to worry about at all? I think in both scenarios, oftentimes you can easily convince yourself that something is important. It's really hard to just leave something and be like, I really want to work on it, but it's not as important as these other things. And like, so it's just going to sit there, and that can be really painful at times and really hard to do. But I think that's a great muscle to exercise in business and in sport, is like, what's getting you to the next stage. And then goal setting. I mean, in the America's Cup, it's pretty easy. Like you're there to win the cup, but I think sort of similar to the last point where it's like, that also has to filter down. So it's hard to win the America's Cup just on its face into actual tasks. And also that's a multi-year campaign. And so then you really just got to start breaking it down. And it's like, all right, what gets us there? What helps us win? And then on a day-to-day basis, checking in on those goals and how are you tracking to that? You know, we had the benefit in the America's Cup of like cost isn't something you have to worry about a whole lot. That isn't true at Halter or at most places. And so you're definitely like, then you add in the kind of financial layer to some of these trade-offs where, you know, if you had to spend $10 million, but you could almost guarantee it's going to win you the America's Cup, you know that they'd be writing that check. That becomes a lot harder in kind of a nominal business context because the output is usually less uncertain. And it's like, well, we can build this product, this feature, and we have some sense that it'll be valuable, but sometimes how valuable it is can be hard to discern. And so you really have to make some decisions on incomplete data sometimes, but still just being clear about like what the objective is, why we're doing it, what we expect to get out of it, and then just having accountability to those results of, all right, we built the thing. Did it give us the sales result we wanted? Maybe not. And that's fine. Learn the lessons you can from that and apply that to your next feature. You know, maybe that reveals something about the customer that gives you great insight into the next thing you want to build. And maybe that's the real unlock. Sometimes it's as important to learn from what doesn't work as learn from what does work.
It sounds to me like a lot of that is this continuous improvement, being 1% better today comparing to yesterday, so that you know you can keep improving. And even when you're sailing, you don't really know if you're going to win. But as long as you're improving, we know we are probably going to the right direction. Similar with our features or how we work as a team. If we are improving, then at least that's kind of the leading indicator to the future success.
Yeah, it sounds so cliche, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, it's so simple. You just make sure you improve, right? Like easy. I mean, obviously the devil is very much in the details, but
Yeah.
I mean, in the last cup, you know, I wasn't a part of the team, so I don't have any inside baseball, but by and large, the general consensus was that Ineos kind of at the start of racing most people would not have picked them to go to the America's Cup match. Their rate of improvement over that like 3-month time span far exceeded the other teams. And so I guess also just a great demonstration of be really clear about what you're improving, why you're doing it. And then also just never give up. Like the come from behind victories happen all the time in business and in sport. And until the last chip is played and you're out, like there's always something more you can do, to the point where we had all these little bits and bobs that we were working on right up till the very last day, until we knew that there wasn't going to be another race. We were looking for that 0.001% incremental gain, because you just never know if that's going to be the difference maker. And I think if you have that mindset where you're just constantly trying to eke out those small gains and grind in that way, that's always going to serve you well, no matter like what you're looking at.
Oh, I think what a great way to finish. Great inspiration, I think, for all of us. Thank you, Brett. That was fascinating conversation. And thank you for sharing all of these unique experiences, because most of us haven't worked through something like this. So it's great to have you on the show. And thank you for your time, your stories, and not being afraid to share some of the maybe the hard parts as well. I think that's super valuable for all of us. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure being here. I could talk about sailing for days. So it was an easy conversation for me, but yeah, I really loved it. And thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks. Oh, what a ride that was. Huge thanks again to Brett for sharing his incredible journey from the intense pressure of America's Cup sailing to the innovations frontlines at Halter. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to continue shaping the next generation of tech leadership in New Zealand, please share this episode and subscribe. Until next time, keep pushing for those incremental gains, because they really do add up. Thanks for listening.